Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Is the Syrian conflict a geopolitical watershed that marks the decline of Western influence in the Arab Middle East? And what is the future of this important region as Washington debates direct involvement in the Syrian crisis? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Ammar Waqqaf. He's a Syrian political activist. We also have Bassam Tablieh. He's a member of the Syrian opposition party. And here in the studio with me in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio is Andrey Sushentsov. He's a political analyst at Moscow State University of International Relations. Ammar, if I can go to you first in London. As the Americans debate the future of their policy in looking at Syria, how much is the West still controlling political outcomes in that very volatile region?
Well, one of the theories about the use of chemical weapons is actually to push the West in order to reassert sort of its authority. The main objective seems to be to push the West to intervene militarily because there is, with such a challenge, someone might say, well, the Americans are not doing anything about it. Let's do something about it in Syria that would force them to intervene, and America would be put in a position whereby it won't tolerate losing more of its influence over there, and then they would have to intervene to the benefit of that particular party. This is my theory, at least.
Bassam, if I go to you also in London, you can take that theory. I find it quite attractive in a way, but if you push that theory to its ultimate extreme, the West could lose enormous influence, because if we look at the last three conflicts in the greater Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, in the last 10 years, it hasn't panned out too well for the West.
In fact, in my opinion, the West wants to intervene because there is a breach of international law. They always allege that they are the protector of human rights and the police for applying the international law. By breaching the international law and using chemical weapons, this will give them a dilemma, honestly, that they have to intervene. Especially there is a huge pressure from the Syrian people, from the international community, that they should take a step to stop this dictator from killing the Syrian citizens. Therefore, they found themselves that in a position that they should act in order to protect their reputation and in order for a future if there is any problem.
Okay, I will be quite cynical here. Andrey, if I can go to you, sitting next to me here in Moscow. How many people in Syria does Barack Obama have to kill to protect his reputation?
That's quite a question. I would add to the thing that was just said about the international law. I think that extremism in legalism and international legalism is not that appropriate in this situation. First, big powers in international relations tend to interpret international law in the preferable way.
You mean out of self-interest, geopolitical self-interest?
Well, putting it in that direct sense, yes. That deals also with Russia, actually, and it deals with the United States, where the two countries which still has the top level of sovereignty in international relations currently. I think that the Security Council is indeed the institution which has enough authority to produce any decisions which involve use of military power in international conflict currently. And I agree with you, Peter, that currently what is at stake in Syria for the United States is their presence in the region and also its authority to project its influence there.
Ammar, I don't like to go to extremes and exaggerate too much, but considering what Andrey just said, the historical analogy that comes to my mind, and it's quite disturbing, it's August 1914, because again we get down to credibility, legacy, reputation. Barack Obama has really been very blurry in his approach to this awful conflict in Syria. Do you think that his thinking and going to Congress will actually just make it worse?
I share that, your cynical optimism about 1914, actually, but I think Barack Obama both was forced to go to Congress and saw in that a sort of opportunity as well. First of all, what happened here in London last week was quite monumental. Basically, the Parliament could not bypass, and this is for the first time in years really, the sweeping public opinion against a direct intervention in Syria. So this had repercussions, across the West. Barack Obama, in a sense, so people in France and in the US were asking, well, if the British could actually speak their voice out and then speak their mind out in their parliament, how come we can't as well? But I think the reason why, or the main reason why Barack Obama went to Congress is apart from him being really in a nick of a time to either call a strike before the G20 summit in St Petersburg or not, and so on and so forth, he wasn't sure about the outcome. He still probably isn't sure about the outcome. Would this spill into a regional war or not? Would the attacking force be surprised by, whatever resistance? This cost,
Ammar,
he probably cannot bear it alone.
If that's the thinking, then the rational choice is not to intervene, because if you don't know what's going to happen the day after, or even have an idea what's going to happen the day after, it's better to stay out. Wouldn't logic dictate that?
It does, it certainly does, but let's remember that what is at stake here, providing that indeed the primary reason for using chemical weapons is to cause America or to push America to the limit in order to intervene, then probably he really has no choice but to intervene. But he wants to take off his shoulder the accountability later on by involving the Congress and saying, you made this decision as much as I did, and I won't have to be singled out afterwards.
But Bassam, if I can go to you also in London, that's cold comfort for the civilians that will be killed by Tomahawk missiles, isn't it? I'm sorry, that's just because Barack Obama wants to spread the risk and spread the responsibility doesn't change the political and international law calculus on the ground in Syria.
Don't forget that this war started more than 2.5 years, whereby more than 210,000 being killed, more than 200,000 being arrested, more than 8 million now become refugees, 6 inside Syria and 2 million outside Syria. There are really disaster what's going on in Syria, and therefore the Syrian people were asking and still asking for the international intervene in Syria. Therefore, whatever the amount of victims in the end of the day by American rockets, this doesn't reach to the limit where the Assad killed of the civilian. Don't forget that we are seeking for this intervention in order to protect ourselves from the chemical weapon which is in the position of Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad will not hesitate to kill us.
But with all due respect, we still have not been provided evidence of who did what. I'd like to point out to our listeners that the French have done some research on this, the Germans, the British, and the Americans, and quite remarkably, they all come up with different conclusions. Andrey, would you like to speculate about that? Because we hear all of this noise coming out of the United States and in Congress, but even if Congress gives Barack Obama some kind of authorization, any military assault against Syria by the United States would still, by definition, be illegal under international law. I don't care what some Texas senator has to say about Syria, because it's immaterial.
Well, I agree that the facts which we currently possess about this alleged chemical attack near Damascus are not satisfying to point out who was responsible for it. Indeed, French, we in Russia, Britons, Germans and Americans have different viewpoints on this, and the facts which were indeed provided by the American State Department to Russian Foreign Ministry, they are not satisfactory, actually. I can compare them to the facts which were provided dealing with the Iraqi program of nuclear and weapons of mass destruction a decade ago. Also, this database contained some interpreted translations of phone talks, some alleged just intercepted conversations about that. And part of the information which Americans had about Iraq, it actually came from the Iraqi opposition in foreign countries and inside the United States. And there have been several guys, including Ahmed Chalabi, who was behind what was afterwards interpreted as a misinformation of the CIA.
Or disinformation of the CIA.
Yeah, or disinformation of the CIA. And CIA had to, just conclude that, they shifted the responsibility for the decisions or for the conclusions which they took at that time to this.
Well, nonetheless, it seems, if I could sum up what you're saying, this is not a very solid case. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ammar, if I go back to you in London, let's still look at the broader picture here. If the United States, if Barack Obama is worried about his credibility and reputation and ultimately legacy, who is he speaking to? Is he speaking to the Iranians, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Egyptians? Who?
What we know is that he's probably sending some people to Tehran. I know that Jeff Feltman went there, the Omani as well. Foreign minister, I think he went there, and so on and so forth. He's obviously talking to the Saudis and Israelis and the Turks, and I don't know, the status of the relation
Well,
with
the reason
Egypt.
why I'm asking this, is if you look at the array of military forces around Syria, you have Turkey and you have Israel. So if these two countries fear this Assad regime, they have more than enough capability to enter that conflict and turn the tide in a matter of weeks, with 400,000 troops in the Turkish army alone. And everyone knows Israel is a regional superpower. So why? Again, who is Obama proving what to whom? Why is it the United States?
Yeah, I think, again, what probably his frame of mind now is that what is at stake here is whether America is going to come out of this a dependable ally or not. That, gives their allies in the region and potential allies in the region, whether solid like the Saudis or probable less solid like the Jordanians, for example. I mean, how would they perceive America later on? Is it a dependable force? Can they really make a decision whether internal or domestic or external, foreign, and rely on America's, being a superpower that would come to their aid or not? I think that's what is on his mind. It's not about defeating the Syrian military machine.
Well, it's a very interesting point, but how long, if I'm going to Bassam, how long can the United States do that with its so-called pivot to Asia, its in one form or another withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq? I mean, at what point in time, this used to be a mandate with the British and the French. I mean, when do we turn the page in history where there are different forces on the ground that determine political outcomes there? The United States can't do it forever.
Okay, first of all, let me comment about about the legal grounds for the intervention in Syria. You said there is no legal grounds. In fact, no, I disagree with you. I believe the USA has legitimate grounds to intervene in Syria. Number one,
is the United States being threatened by the Assad regime?
Number one is the United States and Turkey are a part of NATO, and Syria has attacked and dropped Turkish airlines. Therefore, Turkey has the right to defend its lands and skies. Therefore, as a part of the NATO, they are entitled to call other states to intervene. This is number one. Number two.
But NATO itself has made it extremely clear that it is not interested in any military strike.
That's the number two. Number
Assad.
two. That's the reason I'm saying.
Okay.
Number two, I'll give you grounds of the legitimacy for intervention. Number two, according to the General Assembly of the United Nations, states, especially like those states which has the power or veto rights, also they have the right to intervene in order to protect the peaceful and security of the state. Therefore, they have the right to intervene based on that. There is a human call from Syrian for the international to call and intervene, because
what you're mentioning is the right to protect. Is that what you're mentioning? Humanitarian intervention.
This is number three, in fact, yes. The difference here between Syria and Iraq, where the Syrian people, they are calling for help.
Well, I mean, if you're looking at humanitarian intervention, let me cite the law, not what people think, but what is written down. A humanitarian intervention is provided when, number one, there is convincing evidence generally accepted by the international community as a whole of extreme humanitarian distress on a large scale requiring immediate and urgent relief. Syria doesn't pass the test there. Number two, it would be objectively clear that there are no practical alternatives to the use of force. Syria doesn't apply. The proposed use of force must be necessary and proportional to the aim of relief of humanitarian need. Mr. Obama has no idea what that is. So on all three counts of humanitarian intervention, Syria doesn't pass the test. Andrey.
Well, I would just add to this that we didn't witness for these 2 decades any well-grounded settlement of international conflict from outside force, including the cases in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya currently. What we see in Iraq, I think that is the most picturesque thing, because more people have died there not because of the American intervention, but because of the American inability to build their stable security structure. The violence and this actual civil war, which is, it is currently in the extent which it had been several years ago. And even more people are dying currently. And can we say that this is a success of the aims which the United States wanted to have in Iraq concluded? I don't think that that is a picture which you won't have in Syria. I think that any kind of violent intervention inside Syria will even deepen the problems which are currently in the state. I don't see in expert community in the United States attention to the real causes of the civil strife inside Syria, the real understanding of the interethnic strife, the sectarian distinction, ethnopolitical, geographical, and all others. The conflict in Syria, it's in part, it is part of the Arab Spring, but actually Syria as a nation state, as a state in its current form, was formed just in the period after the World War II, and its current borders do not precisely have the single ethnic body inside. And this is probably the most important single circumstance and the fact which helps further this conflict in Syria.
Bassam, if I go back to you in London, let's say, for example, hypothetical, Obama does strike command centers and military facilities. What would you like to see happen the next day after that strike?
First of all, destroying the chemical weapon. Number two, falling the Assad regime. Because at the end
Do
of the
you feel
day,
confident? Do you feel confident that cruise missiles can destroy chemical weapons? What about if they're in civilian areas, populated areas? Wouldn't that make the problem even worse? I mean, these things are extremely deadly. We all know that. Shouldn't it be done more carefully, to say the least? Do you think that a bomb is going to solve that problem? It could make it even worse.
according to the chemical experts, they said if there is like an explosion for the or using of chemical weapon, then if you are, for example, using more bombing in that area where the oxygen or the chemical gas will be destroyed, this will reduce the effect of the chemical weapons. Secondly,
Okay, that sounds very theoretical. How do you think that's going to play out in practice?
Because
It's
we
in
believe
a
this is the
neighborhood,
how-
and there are schools and mosques and
in
what's
reality,
wrong.
this is what the Assad regime did when he used the chemical weapon. After he sent his chemical missiles, he started bombing that particular areas where he reduced the effect of that chemical weapons in order to not at later stage not to be defined or discover that he's the one who did it. It's a game in the end of the day, honestly. But one thing we saw that Assad regime used the chemical weapon from
This is
Kasyoun.
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt, but this is still speculation. We don't have a lot of evidence. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Amir, it sounded like you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, first of all, yes, we are quite a mile away from really ascertaining who did this and why they did this. What we know for sure is that the other party as well, especially the Jabhat al-Nusra al-Qaeda affiliated group, possess sarin gas as well. I mean, 12 of them were detained in Turkey back in May with a possession of 2 kilograms. And 2 kilograms are theoretically capable of killing 4 million people. So we know that they have the material, and the capability of the attacks that took place is not really complicated. You don't need a Scud missile to kill 50 people here and 100 people there. But what I would probably want to point out here is that the Americans or Obama administration is not really interested of ridding the Syrians from their chemical capability. What they're interested more in is actually to degrade the capability of the Syrian army as a whole, as I listened yesterday to a very lengthy interview with an American general, and later on try to upgrade the capability of the rebels. So what they're trying to do now is that obviously this is under the guise of a punitive action against the use of chemical weapons, but we don't know who used them. Probably they're interfering intervening in the wrong direction here, especially if Al-Qaeda have chemical weapons. But what they need to do is to hit command and control centers, measure, army points, maintenance depots, and so on and so forth, let alone forces, in order to degrade significantly the capability of the Syrian army.
So if I can just sum it up here, it's because Assad's winning the civil war. This is why the Americans have to intervene. Andrey?
In my understanding, in my observations, Obama personally doesn't want this war.
Agreed.
I tried to follow quite closely. He's saying,
And he's been
quite
foolish in the past when he says Assad must go. I have my red line. This is foolishness. This is a very immature foreign policy because, again, I guess we keep talking about the same thing: credibility. When the president of the United States says something, people expect him to follow up on it, even if it's.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. Look, I think that what is happening currently with his administration and him personally, he has been hijacked by his promises in the past. He doesn't want this war. He understands that probably this will have some grave consequences that would follow just behind what he is expecting. And actually, all of his recent decisions to go for the Congress, to listen to some part of his military establishment, including General Dempsey, who says that strikes can wait, no rush, let us figure out what has happened, let us listen to the United Nations experts. I think that that's, of course, some kind of, in Russian understanding, in Russia, we have a tradition of very slow foreign policy. slow but, decisive. When Putin hasn't said a word about Syria until recently.
Well, so far the Russians haven't had to eat their words over the last 2.5 years. Their position has been quite consistent.
Well, we had our problems in the past, actually, and that is our national experience, and this is why we understand what does word mean. So when you say something, you need to follow it. I think that this period for the United States policies in the Middle East is a period of gaining experience in a violent region when you had to back off from your promises. And I agree with actually Senator McCain, who said that...
Oh, my goodness.
Yes. If the Congress would say no, that would be a grave back off for the American standing in the Middle East and for its foreign policy.
Okay, gentlemen, there's 2 points I want to cover before we end the program. We've talked about all through this program about whether Obama will get the authorization from Congress, which I still stand by would not be valid under international law. But what happened to diplomacy? Ammar, what happened to diplomacy? I thought that we were going to have Geneva 2.2, and Kerry was here, and Lavrov, and they were buddy-buddy, and we're going to move forward, and where is it?
Well, there are two levels of diplomacy here. The level between the Russians and the Americans, so to speak, which is the outer one, and probably you could attach to that a bit of regional one. And then there is the direct diplomacy with the Syrian state itself. What happened was that everybody was trying to focus on the international sort of diplomacy and forgetting to talk with, apart from the Russians really, forgetting to talk with the Syrian government that still exists and is still the recognized government of the country. And strangely enough, we were in this discussion yesterday, and over the past week and so on, I've met with politicians here and MPs and so on and so forth, and people who are interested, and everybody was saying the same. We've got to open up to talking again with the Syrian government. We just cannot, because at one moment in time they probably thought, well, it's going to fall within the next month.
But isn't that eating your words again? Isn't that eating your words again?
It is.
I don't even know who's recognized by European countries as the sole legitimate government of the Syrian people. I don't even remember what it's called now. There's been so many different groups. I mean, this is, again, this is a credibility issue. I mean, now, we're going to change our mind. We'll go talk
wishful
to Assad
thinking
now.
As well.
Okay, wishful thinking as well. Bassam, what do you think about that? From what I understood so far on the program, that there's no need in your mind to talk to the Assad regime at all.
First of all, let me comment about or remind my friend Ammar about the two people who are being caught with a chemical weapon in Turkey. Don't forget, I just want to say, don't forget that Assad sent many peoples, and they've been discovered at later stage that they works with the regime. So we have suspicion about those people that they works with the Assad. So therefore, those 2 kilos of chemical weapons might belong to the Assad, number one. Number two, in reply to your question, in fact, for the last 2.5 years, Assad didn't stop killing the Syrian people, the civilian. For the last 2.5 years, when we were talking and asked for dialogue, seeking for diplomacy, seeking for everything, any political solution, Assad didn't stop, and he used always his barrels, his missiles, his all sort of military weapons against the civilian. Now, see, there is a report where it shows that more than a third of the victims are children and women. So what?
But do you think you would recognize that the Assad regime is fighting somebody, and that somebody is fighting back? There is armed groups.
They're killing civilians as well.
And some of them extremely vicious and with ideologies that I think most people with common sense would find abhorrent.
Don't forget, when we started 2.5 years ago, we started in a peaceful civil demonstration. All what we asked for liberty. Initially, we asked for amendment, kill this corruption things. We don't want to see any more corruptions. But what we faced is just killing the civilian. So we started, I personally and others people, we started talking, we sought for dialogue and just to find a solution for this dilemma. Unfortunately, Assad didn't listen to us. Rather, he started arresting civilians. Now see how many people in that.
But the other side of the coin is that Western powers, primarily under the guise of NATO, have tried this before and they have utterly failed. And this is what a lot of people, just as we were sitting down, there's a call for the French Parliament to vote on any kind of intervention on the heels of the UK Parliament and what's going on in Congress. I mean, the Western polities are getting sick and tired of these wars because they don't see what aim it furthers their own foreign policies. And Raytheon, one of the biggest arms dealers, their share price is at a record high right now. I mean, people are starting to make those connections. Gentlemen, we're almost out of time, and I'd like all three of you to comment on something. Andrey first. A cynic will say this is not about Syria, has nothing to do with Syria, has everything to do about Iran. The way to Tehran is through Damascus.
Well, I would not subscribe to this. I think that the situation is much more complicated, and the United States, at this point, at this stage, they are not well prepared, I think, for any kind of development would follow the Syrian strike. And in my understanding, the time for crushing Iran has passed. Iran is quite,
Again, go back to Ammar, what he said earlier is that there's pressure on the outside. Don't you think the Saudis are saying to Obama, this is our opportunity? Because this is, again, it's regional players looking to the day after.
I think the Saudis just cannot imagine that they can strike and crush Iran.
No, they want the Americans to do it. That's my point.
I think that Americans also cannot crush Iran because it is well developed, quite modern, with specific features, but still quite a modernized state with massive armaments, etc., etc. So I think that this current impasse, I would call it, is uncomfortable for everybody, including Americans. Besides what they're saying about the human rights and this alleged use of chemical weapons, Obama is a rational man, I hope, and I think that he understands that any strike on Syria right now will have consequences, would hurt the United States.
Ammar, it's all about Iran. React to that.
I think, yeah, but to some extent, in the regional level, it is. I mean, we haven't spoken about the Israelis yet into this. I think Israel does see a breakup in the alliance between Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria is a very important thing. They view Iran as an ideology that is not going to change its mind over time with disregard to the interests that are thrown in their way. Obviously, the rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians have been there for decades, and they've led, we know, to the Iraqi-Iranian war already, with like 8 years of bloodshed and so on. And that is very much on the cards. But I would argue that this is on a regional level. On the American level, probably they're more interested in their, geopolitical sphere of influence and tightening that up.
Bassam, how would you put the Iranian card into this game? I have known people in politics in the United States for decades, and the obsession in Washington with Iran, it almost gets to the point of pathological. This is, for some neocons, a real opportunity to to get to Iran. They may have to destroy Syria completely, but for some people that's not a high price to pay because, they don't live in Syria.
To some extent, I agree with you about this, honestly. As Iran is a strong country, therefore they need to demolish or at least to weaken Iran before that. Unfortunately, as we are fully aware that states are not charities, therefore if they want to intervene or support, it's going to be for a particular interest. Saudi Arabia wants to fight Iran on Syrian land and using the Syrian civilian. I agree about that, but unfortunately, there's nothing we can do because Bashar al-Assad didn't cooperate with the Syrian, with ourselves. So at least we can reach to an agreement to settle this problem, rather than he just listened to Iran and obeyed Iran's orders. In the end of the day, we found ourselves in this dilemma.
All right, gentlemen, we ended on the word dilemma. I want to thank my guests, Ammar, Bassam, and Andrey here sitting with me in Voice of Russia's studio in Moscow. You've been listening to Debating Russia on Voice of Russia.